The woman who chose death. Until a stranger changed everything. She had nothing left. No husband, no home, no reason to take another breath. Standing alone on a desolate Montana road, Maren Whitlock, a widow the world had discarded, held poisonous berries in her trembling palm, ready to disappear forever. One swallow. That was all it would take. Then a stranger's horse skidded to a halt in the gravel beside her. He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer prayers. He offered her a job. What happened next would shock an entire frontier and prove that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone chose to underestimate. If you've ever been written off by someone who didn't bother to look closer, this story is for you. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far Maren's story travels. The berries sat in her palm like small, dark promises. Maren Whitlock had held many things in her 38 years. A husband's hand at the altar, a baby who never drew its first breath, ledger books and flour sacks, and the worn wooden handle of a cast-iron skillet. She had held grief, too, longer than she had held anything else. But she had never held something that felt so final, so quietly merciful as these 7 small berries sitting in the cup of her weathered palm on a nameless stretch of Montana road in the autumn of 1883. She wasn't crying. That surprised her still. She had imagined this moment on the bad nights, the very bad nights, as something wet and trembling. She had imagined herself shaking. Instead, she felt only a profound stillness, like the surface of a pond after the last ripple has gone. Everything that could be taken from her had already been taken. There was nothing left to be afraid of losing. Just do it, she told herself. You've been brave long enough. She had walked 4 miles from the crossroads settlement of Dunmore Flats, where the last of her money had bought her nothing but a night on the floor of a crowded boarding house and the barely disguised contempt of a landlady who had looked at Maren's wide hips and threadbare dress and said, loudly enough for the other guests to hear, "We don't usually take in her kind." Her kind. In 38 years, Maren had learned exactly what that phrase meant. It meant a woman whose body did not fit the narrow shape the world had decided was acceptable. It meant a woman who laughed too freely, who spoke when she wasn't spoken to, who had opinions about crop rotations and contract law and the proper way to stretch a beef stock. It meant a woman who had loved a man named Thomas Whitlock for 11 years, who had kept his books and managed his accounts and held his ranch together through 2 droughts and 1 catastrophic flood, and who, when Thomas died of a fever in the spring, had discovered that the law did not consider any of that labor a form of ownership. The ranch had gone to Thomas's brother, Edmund, who had visited exactly twice in 11 years. Edmund, who had looked at Maren across the funeral supper and said, with the particular cruelty of a man who believes himself to be simply practical, "I'm sure you understand, Maren. A woman in your situation can't manage a property of this size." She had understood perfectly. She had always understood too much. The road stretched ahead of her, empty and pale as bleached bone. The Montana sky was the color of pewter, hammered flat. A hawk turned slow circles far above, patient as death itself. The pines on either side stood motionless, holding their breath. Maren raised her hand toward her mouth. The sound reached her before the man did. The hard, rhythmic percussion of a horse moving fast over packed earth. Then the sudden spray of gravel as the animal was reined in hard, close enough that Maren felt the rush of displaced air against her cheek. She closed her fist around the berries. "Ma'am." The voice was low and rough, the way certain stones are rough, not with hostility, but with texture. The kind of voice that had spent more time outdoors than in. She turned slowly, in no particular hurry, because she had already decided that whatever this interruption was, it would not change anything. The man on the horse was perhaps 45, built like someone had constructed him from the same material as the landscape, hard and angular and weathered to a permanent brown. A wide-brimmed hat threw his face into partial shadow, but she could see a jaw that looked like it had been set once, perhaps badly, and never quite corrected. He was looking at her hand. "Those are nightshade berries," he said. Not a question. "I'm aware," Maren said. A silence stretched between them, taut as wire. "You going to eat them?" She met his eyes. Gray, she noticed, the color of the sky behind him, and carrying something in them she hadn't expected. Not pity, not shock. Something more like the recognition one exhausted person extends to another. "That was my intention," she said. He didn't reach for her. He didn't cry out or lunge from his horse with dramatic heroism. He simply looked at her for a long moment, as though calculating something with considerable care. "How long since you've eaten?" he said at last. The question was so entirely unexpected that she blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Food. A real meal. How long?" Marin opened her mouth to tell him it was none of his business. Then, almost against her will, she counted backward. The boarding house in Dunmore Flats had offered nothing. Before that, 2 days on a freight wagon, subsisting on stale hardtack, a teamster had taken pity on her enough to share. Before that, 2 days, she said. Perhaps 3. He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. "There's a cookhouse on my property that hasn't had a proper cook since April. It's a disaster. My hands are eating charred beans and reconstituted jerky, and they're getting mean about it." He paused. "I need someone who knows what they're doing. I'll pay wages, room and board included." Marin stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "No. You don't know if I can cook. Can you?" She thought of the 11 years of meals she had produced from Thomas's ranch kitchen. The bread that had made the hands stop their work just to stand near the window where the smell drifted out. The preserved peaches that had gotten her through her first Montana winter. The Sunday roast that had become a ritual so fixed that the ranch dogs learned to appear at the kitchen door precisely at noon. She thought of the county fair where her preserved goods had taken first place 3 years running, until the judge's wife had grown so irritated that she'd quietly rearranged the competition categories. "Yes," Marin said, "I can cook." "Then I'm offering honest work for honest pay." He looked at her hand again, at the closed fist. "And I'm asking you to put those down." "Why?" The word came out harder than she intended, stripped down to its skeleton. "Why does it matter to you? You don't know me. You owe me nothing." He was quiet for a moment. The hawk above them called once, a thin, sharp sound, and banked east. "It doesn't matter to me," he said at last, and something about the brutal honesty of it hit her harder than any false comfort could have. "Not personally. I don't know you well enough for it to matter personally." He pulled at the rein as his horse shifted beneath him. "But I've seen men, good men, come back from war having made the same decision you're standing at the edge of right now, and I've watched most of them regret not taking the other road. Even the ones who had it bad." He paused. "That's all I've got." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the kind of speech that would survive being written down. But it was honest in the way that the land around them was honest. Without decoration, without apology, without any promise that the world would be easier than it was. Marin looked down at the berries in her palm. She thought about Edmund's face across the funeral supper. She thought about the landlady's voice, her kind. She thought about Thomas. Not the Thomas at the end, but the Thomas from the beginning, the one who had sat across a kitchen table from her in the first year of their marriage, watching her work through the quarterly accounts, and said with genuine wonder, "How do you see all of it at once, Marin? How do you hold all of it in your head?" She had never had an answer for that. It was simply the way she was built, to see patterns, to track details, to notice the thing that didn't belong. She opened her hand. She let the berries fall onto the dirt of the road. "What did you say your name was?" she asked. "Didn't," he said. "Gideon Mercer." He nudged his horse a step closer and extended his hand, the gesture so matter-of-fact it almost made her smile. "And you?" She took his hand. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who had learned to measure worth in output rather than appearance. "Marin Whitlock." "The ranch is 4 miles north," he said. "I've got a spare horse at the Crossroads livery. You want to walk? We can walk. But the offer expires at sundown." She looked north. The road was long and pale and empty, and whatever waited at the end of it was entirely unknown. "I'll walk," she said. "I'm not ready to trust a strange horse just yet." Something shifted in his jaw. Not quite a smile, but perhaps the structural foundation one might eventually be built upon. "Fair enough," he said, and turned his horse to walk beside her. The Mercer Ranch revealed itself slowly, the way all things worth seeing do. First the smell of pine smoke, then the distant shape of a water tower against the pewter sky, then the full spread of it coming around a curve in the road. A main house? A bunkhouse? 3 outbuildings, a large barn, and a structure slightly separated from the rest that could only be the cookhouse, listing slightly to the left like a man who'd had too much to drink and hadn't quite committed to falling down. She counted what she saw automatically, old habit, and the numbers were not encouraging. 2 fence sections clearly broken and jury-rigged, 3 hay bales sitting in the open where they shouldn't be, the barn door hanging wrong on its hinge, the gap wide enough to let cold in and heat out. She noted these things without comment, storing them away. The ranch hands noticed her arrival the way cattle notice a new presence in their field, with collective, wary stillness that only gradually resolved into individuals. She counted 7 of them visible, ranging from a teenager with a sunburned neck to a man old enough to be her father, all watching with varying degrees of suspicion as Gideon swung down from his horse and gestured toward the tilting cookhouse. "You can start tomorrow morning," he said. "Tonight, I'll have someone clear out the back room. It's small, but it's private. There's a lock on the door." The lock on the door. The deliberateness of that detail, the fact that he had anticipated that she would want it, told her something about the man she chose to file carefully for later consideration. "I'll need to see the inventory," she said. "Whatever provisions you have, and the condition of the stove." He nodded. "I'll show you." The cookhouse interior was exactly as disastrous as the exterior had promised. The long table was covered in a drift of used tin plates. The stove had a cracked firebox door that had clearly been forced shut with a piece of bent iron and optimism. The flour barrel was nearly empty, and what remained had gone slightly damp. The lard tin had been left open. 3 cast iron skillets were coated in a layer of grease so old and thick it had begun to approach the philosophical, but the bones of it were sound. Marin walked the length of the room in silence, touching things, opening things, running her finger along surfaces. Gideon stood in the doorway and watched without commenting, which she appreciated. "I can work with this," she said finally. "You sure? I've worked with worse." She turned to look at him. "I'll need flour, lard, and salt pork by morning at the latest. Coffee beans, not grounds. Whoever's been grinding them is doing it wrong. 2 pounds of dried beans, whatever root vegetables your cellar has." She paused. "And that firebox door needs to be repaired properly before I light this stove. I won't cook on a cracked firebox. It's a fire waiting to happen." He said nothing for a moment, and she braced herself. For the argument, for the implication that she was being difficult, for the particular male discomfort with a woman who stated her requirements plainly. Instead, he said, "I'll have one of my men look at the door tonight." "Thank you. The supplies I can get from Dunmore Flats first thing in the morning." "Good." He was quiet again, studying her with that same gray measuring regard. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Marin." "Marin." A brief pause, as though adjusting to the geography of the name. "I want to be honest with you about something. I'd prefer that to the alternative. This ranch is in trouble." He said it without dramatics, without self-pity, in the flat way of a man stating the weather. "Serious trouble. Been a string of bad luck, accidents, losses I can't entirely account for. My operation is smaller than it was a year ago, and I don't fully understand why." His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. "I want good food in this cookhouse because hungry men are short-tempered men, and I need steady hands right now. But I want you to know what you're walking into." Marin regarded him for a long moment in the failing afternoon light. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Gideon." "Gideon." She let the name settle. "My husband is dead. My home has been taken from me by the law and a man who never worked a single day for it. I was standing on a road an hour ago, having run entirely out of other options." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not afraid of trouble. I'm afraid of nothing left to do." Something moved across his face, too quickly to name, but present. "Then we understand each other," he said. "I believe we do." He nodded once and left her to the wreckage of the cookhouse, and Marin Whitlock stood alone in the center of it, in the fading light, and began to think about what she would make for breakfast. The first morning she rose before the sun. She had slept surprisingly in the small back room with its single window and its new-smelling lock, slept the deep, blunt sleep of a body that had been pushing past exhaustion for so long that it had simply stopped negotiating. She woke in the dark, feeling alert in a way she hadn't felt in months, her mind already moving. The firebox door had been repaired. She discovered this when she examined the stove in the lamplight, finding a clean weld where the cracked iron had been. She didn't know which of Gideon's men had done it, but the quality of the work was good, careful, the work of someone who took the task seriously. She got the fire going and started water for coffee. When the first ranch hands came in 40 minutes later, bleary, suspicious, their hats already on, they were met with the smell of properly brewed coffee, hot cornbread coming out of a properly sealed oven, and a large pot of white beans that Marin had soaked overnight and brought to a slow, fragrant simmer with salt pork and a handful of dried herbs she'd found tucked behind a cracked ceramic jar on the back shelf. They stopped in the doorway. The youngest one, the boy with the sunburned neck, who she'd later learn was called Jesse, blinked as though he'd walked into something solid. "That the same kitchen?" he said to no one in particular. "Sit down," Marin said pleasantly. "Coffee's ready." She watched them take their places, watched the subtle recalibration as the first sip of properly made coffee hit them, watched the cornbread disappear faster than she had expected. She would need to adjust quantities. And she began to take mental inventory of what she was working with. 7 men, varied appetites, one with what looked like a wheat sensitivity given the way he'd already pushed the cornbread to the side while eating the beans with undisguised enthusiasm. She filed this away. An older man, heavy-set and square-faced, who the others called Walt, set his cup down and looked at her with direct, undecorated skepticism. "You the new cook Mercer hired?" "That's right." "You got experience?" 11 years running a working ranch kitchen. Walt looked her up and down with the particular unimpressed thoroughness of a man who had decided his opinion in advance. "You look like you sampled the product quite a bit." The table went quiet. Marin had been waiting for this. Not from Walt specifically, but from someone. There was always a someone. She had decided, somewhere on the road the day before, that she was done flinching from it. She set the coffee pot down on the table with a deliberate, measured movement, and she looked at Walt directly. "I look like a woman who knows how to cook," she said calmly. "And from the state of those tin plates I cleaned last night, you've been eating like men who don't have one. So you can keep your observations about my figure to yourself, or you can find somewhere else to eat breakfast." A brief pause. "The beans have another 20 minutes. More coffee?" Walt stared at her. Jesse made a sound that was very carefully not a laugh. Then Walt picked up his cup and held it out. It was not warmth. It was not friendship. But it was something, and Marin had learned to build from something. In the evenings, after the last meal was cleared and the kitchen was clean, Marin began to notice things. She had always been a noticer. Thomas had called it her gift and her affliction in equal measure. The way she could not move through a space without cataloging it. The way her mind assembled details into patterns, the way other people assembled sentences. It had made her an excellent accountant. It had also made her, on occasion, a difficult person to be married to, because she had a tendency to notice things people would have preferred she didn't. She noticed now that the accidents on the Mercer ranch were not random. A fence cut. She had heard Gideon mention it to Walt one morning, curtly and with evident frustration, thinking she wasn't listening. She had been listening. She was always listening. The fence had been cut clean, not broken or damaged by cattle. Cut, with a blade, on the section that bordered the Harlow Creek tributary. The same week, 6 head of cattle had gone missing from the far east pasture, the one adjacent to the creek. Water, she thought. The missing cattle were near the water. A week later, 2 horses gone from the South Corral. The South Corral also bordered the creek. She began to keep records. Old habit. She had kept Thomas's books for a decade, had an accountant's instinct for documentation, for the significance of patterns over time. In a small leather notebook she'd found in the bottom of a supply crate, she started logging dates, locations, types of incidents, and the physical details she caught from overheard conversations and the occasional things she could see from the cookhouse window. She said nothing yet. She had no right to. She was the cook. But the pattern was there, clean and deliberate as the cut in that fence wire, and it had a shape she was beginning to recognize. It was 3 weeks into her time at the ranch when the fire happened. She smelled it before the alarm was raised. A change in the air at 2 a.m, a wrongness, the particular acrid bite of burning hay that is different from the smell of a cook stove. She was up and out of her room in less than a minute, in her coat and boots. And she could see from the cookhouse door that the far corner of the main barn was breathing orange light. The shouting started. Men spilled from the bunkhouse. Gideon came out of the main house already dressed, already running, and she could see from the way he moved that this was not the first time he had run towards something burning. They saved the barn. It took 2 hours and every able hand on the property, bucket brigades from the well and the horse trough, and by the end of it, everyone was soot-blackened and silent with a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting something that wants very badly to win. Maren had worked the bucket line alongside the men without being asked. When it was over, she went back to the cookhouse, rebuilt the fire in the stove, and made coffee and fried salt pork and whatever bread she had left. And she carried it out to the yard on a tray, moving among the men who sat on the ground in the early gray light with the stunned quiet of survivors. Gideon took his tin cup and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Thank you," he said. "The fire started in the southeast corner of the barn," she said quietly. He looked at her sharply. "How do you know?" "I could see from the cookhouse, the southeast corner." She paused, keeping her voice level, factual, the tone she had always used when presenting ledger results that told an uncomfortable story. "That's the corner closest to the hay storage you used to supply the pastures by Harlow Creek." A long silence. "There's a pattern," she said. "I've been keeping notes. I'd like to show them to you. Not now, not tonight, but soon." He stared at her in the gray pre-dawn light, this man who had hired her to cook beans and bake bread, and she watched him process what she had just offered. "You've been keeping notes," he repeated. "Yes." "How long?" "Since the second week." The expression that moved across his face was complicated. Not offense, she decided. Not dismissal. Something more like a man who has been trying to find a door in a dark room and has just felt someone press the handle into his hand. "Show me tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow evening," she agreed, and went back to the cookhouse to put a fresh pot of water on. The sun came up over the Montana hills, pale and cold and utterly indifferent, and Maren Whitlock stood at her stove and watched it rise and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not hope exactly. She was too careful for hope just yet, but was perhaps the absence of hopelessness, which is where all other things eventually begin. She had work to do. She had always been better when she had work to do. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. The notes were 12 pages long. Maren had written them small and close, the way she had always kept ledger entries, efficient, precise, nothing wasted. Dates in the left margin, location in the next column, then a description of the incident, then what she had observed that others might not have noted. She had organized them chronologically at first, then reorganized them by geography, then by type of loss. And it was in that third arrangement that the pattern had become impossible to ignore. She spread the pages across the cookhouse table after the supper dishes were cleared in the lamplight, and Gideon Mercer stood across from her with his hat in his hands and read them in silence for a long time. She watched him read. She had learned in 3 weeks that he was not a man who filled silence with noise, and she appreciated this about him in the way she appreciated a well-balanced scale. It was useful because it was accurate. When he frowned, she knew it was because something had actually troubled him. When he was still, she knew he was thinking rather than performing thought. He was very still now. "The creek," he said finally. "Harlow Creek," she confirmed. "Every incident, every one, is either adjacent to the creek corridor or involves assets that have access to the creek water. The cut fences, the missing cattle, the horses taken from the south corral." She tapped the page with one finger. "And the fire. The southeast corner of the barn. That's where you store the supplemental hay for the creek pastures." Gideon set the pages down slowly. "Someone's trying to push me off the water. Someone is trying to make it look like your operation is failing on its own," Maren said carefully. "That's different. If they simply wanted to cut you off from the water, there are faster ways. What they're doing is slower, more deliberate." She paused. "They want you to give up voluntarily, or to go broke trying to recover from losses that keep coming. Either way, they need you gone without the appearance of force." He looked at her across the table, and there was something in his gray eyes that she recognized. The expression of a man who has suspected something bad for a long time and has just had the suspicion handed back to him fully formed and documented and therefore impossible to dismiss. "I thought it was bad luck," he said very quietly. "I kept telling myself it was bad luck." "People often do," Maren said. "It's more comfortable." How long have you known? I've suspected since the second week. The fence cutting in particular. That was too clean. I grew up on a working ranch, Mr. Mercer. Cattle damage fences in a way that looks entirely different from a blade. She gathered the pages into order. I didn't say anything sooner because I wanted more data before I brought you something that might have been coincidence. 12 pages isn't coincidence. No, she agreed. It isn't. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily, the way a large man sits when he has temporarily stopped holding everything up. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. For a moment, he simply looked tired. Not the bone tired of a long day's work, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has been fighting something he couldn't see and losing ground to it steadily. I have 38 years in this land, he said. My father built the first structure on this property with 4 other men and a borrowed team of oxen. I watched him do it. I was 9 years old. His voice was flat, carrying the words the way a river carries stones, beneath the surface, with weight. I'm not going to lose it to someone I can't even name. Then we need to name him, Marin said. He looked at her. The we had not been accidental, and they both knew it. You said someone's pushing me off the water, he said slowly. Water rights in this territory. Who would want them badly enough to run this kind of campaign? Marin had thought about this. She had lain awake in her small locked room thinking about it, turning the pieces over in the way she had always turned numbers, looking for the underlying logic, the motive beneath the method. Someone who already controls a significant amount of land and is still expanding, she said. The value of Harlow Creek isn't just water for cattle, it's an irrigation source. With the right infrastructure, whoever controls that creek controls what can be grown on 50,000 acres of adjacent land. She folded her hands on the table. That's not ranch country money. That's railroad money, agricultural empire money. Gideon was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Aldous Crane. The name dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. You know him, Marin said. Everybody in this territory knows Crane, or knows of him. Gideon's jaw set in that angle she had come to recognize as his version of controlled anger. He runs his operation out of Caldwell, started with a small spread 15 years ago. Now he's got holdings across 4 counties. People sell to him because they feel they have no choice, or because he makes the alternative look worse than it is. A pause. 3 ranches in the past 2 years, all of them sold cheap, all of them under circumstances that looked like simple misfortune. Did any of them border Harlow Creek? Gideon went still. She watched him make the connection. The Fielding place, he said slowly, and the Barrow homestead, both on the east tributary. Marin said nothing, letting him arrive at it fully. He's working the creek in order, Gideon said. He's been working it in order. His hands, flat on the table, pressed down until his knuckles whitened. I'm the last independent operation on the main channel, which is why the pace is accelerating, Marin said. He's close to finishing. He can afford to push harder now. The lamp between them guttered briefly in a draft from the ill-fitted window, and in the wavering light, Gideon looked older than his years and younger than his weariness, and Marin felt something she hadn't expected, a fierce practical anger on his behalf, as clean and functional as a good blade. She had not come here to care about this man's land. She had come here to cook and survive, and perhaps, in time, to remember what it felt like to have a reason to get up in the morning. But she had spent 3 weeks watching Gideon Mercer treat his men with a rough, unadorned fairness that she recognized as the real thing rather than a performance of it. She had watched him give Jesse, the youngest hand, extra time to master a task rather than berating him for slowness. She had watched him dismiss a hired hand for cruelty to the horses, quietly and without drama, and cover that man's back pay out of his own pocket. She had watched him eat whatever she cooked without complaint and never once comment on what she looked like eating beside him. These were not large gestures, but large gestures were easy. It was the small ones that told you who a person actually was. We need evidence, she said. Patterns point at Crane, but they don't convict him. We need to find whoever he has on the inside. Gideon's head came up sharply. Inside. The fire, Marin said. Someone had to start it from within the property. The fence cuts. Your land is too well ridden for an outsider to move across it regularly without being spotted. Someone on this ranch, or with regular access to it, is feeding information and providing access. She kept her voice even, factual, because she knew how much this would cost him to hear. I'm sorry, but the numbers don't lie. He sat with this for a long moment. She watched it move through him, the betrayal of it, the particular pain of discovering that the rot was closer than the outside. Any of them, he said, could be. Don't assume yet, she said quickly. We look at behavior and access, not suspicion. Suspicion without evidence destroys trust and makes bad accusations. We look at who knew what and when, and we let the pattern tell us. He looked at her steadily. You've done this before. I managed the accounts for a working ranch for 11 years, she said. I caught a supply contractor skimming feed costs over 18 months before anyone else noticed. It's the same logic. People who take from others leave traces. They can't help it. Gideon was quiet for a beat. Then he said, All right. And then, because he was not a man who made promises he didn't keep or offered praise he didn't mean, You're smarter than anyone I've hired in 20 years, Marin. It was simply stated without flourish, and perhaps because of that it hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. Somewhere still tender from all the months of being told the opposite in all the ways people tell you things without using words. She kept her face professional. Let's see if we're smart enough, she said. Over the following weeks, Marin moved through the ranch with her eyes open and her hands busy. She fed men breakfast and supper. She managed her inventory with the fierce precision that had become her natural mode, and she watched. She noticed who lingered near conversations they had no reason to hear. She noticed who disappeared during the hours when the incidents had occurred. She noticed small inconsistencies, a boot print in soft mud near the creek fence, a pattern of absence, a man who received a letter on the same day each week and grew quiet and closed after reading it. His name was Roy Sutton. He was 41, thick-set, with a way of making himself unremarkable that had apparently worked for quite some time. He had been with the ranch for 8 months, long enough before the incidents began to have established trust and routine. She brought this to Gideon one evening, carefully, with the evidence laid out in sequence the way she had always presented accounts. Not the conclusion first, but the journey to it, so the conclusion was inescapable rather than simply asserted. Gideon listened without interrupting. When she finished, his face was very still. Roy Sutton, he said. I'm not certain, Marin said, because honesty required her to say it. I'm 90% certain, which in an accountant's terms means I'm not finished yet. What would make you certain? The letters, she said. Someone is communicating with him. If we knew who sent them, you can't open a man's mail. No, she agreed, but if Roy believed there was a reason to make contact with his employer on short notice, if something happened that required an urgent message. She paused. People in a hurry make mistakes. They use a regular courier rather than a careful one. They choose speed over concealment. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. You want to give him something to report. I want to give Crane something to respond to, she said. Something that sounds like opportunity. A trap. A test first. A trap later, if the test confirms what we suspect. He drummed his fingers once on the table, not with impatience, but with the energy of a man whose mind was moving. And you've thought through how to do this? I've thought through the beginning of it, she said honestly. The rest depends on what Crane does when he's presented with an opportunity that seems too good to ignore. She met his eyes. That part I'll need your help with. You know how he operates. I know how the numbers work. Between those two things, I think we have enough. Something had shifted between them over the past weeks. She was aware of this the way you are aware of a change in elevation, gradually and then all at once. The briskness of the early days had given way to something more like partnership, a working ease, the kind that develops between two people who have discovered they think in compatible ways. She would notice a thing and begin to speak and find that he was already nodding because he had noticed the parallel thing from a different angle. He would ask her something and she would have the answer, not because she was performing competence, but because she genuinely had it. She was careful with this. She was careful with anything that mattered now, because she had learned the cost of being careless with what mattered, but she was not blind to it. The ranch hands, for their part, had undergone their own gradual recalibration. Walt, who had opened hostilities at the breakfast table in the first week, had settled into a gruff, complicated respect that expressed itself primarily through the way he scraped his plate clean and asked, without looking at her, whether there might be any more of the bean soup. Jesse had progressed from barely concealed awe to a kind of cheerful uselessness around the kitchen. He appeared at the cookhouse door on the thinnest of pretexts and had twice asked, with transparent casualness, whether Marin needed any jars moved from the high shelf. She had started leaving things on the high shelf on purpose. There was one afternoon, a Sunday, when the work slowed in the way it sometimes did, and the light came across the hills at the angle that made the whole territory look like something from before the world had gotten complicated. Marin was sitting outside the cookhouse on an overturned crate, taking stock of her supply list, when Gideon came and stood nearby with a cup of coffee and the particular posture of a man who had something he was considering whether or not to say. She waited. "My wife," he said eventually, "left 6 years ago. Took our daughter to her sister's place in Ohio. Said she couldn't do the frontier anymore." A pause. "I don't blame her. I never have. It's a hard life for someone who didn't choose it all the way down." Marin looked at her list and didn't look up, because she understood instinctively that looking up would make him stop talking, and she thought he needed to keep going. "Did she choose it halfway?" she asked. "She chose me," he said. "I'm not sure she fully understood that I came with all this." He gestured with his cup at the spread of the ranch, the hills, the impossible sky. "Some men can leave a place. I couldn't leave this one. Never figured out if that's a strength or a flaw." "Probably both," Marin said. He looked at her with something that was almost amusement. "Thomas, your husband, what was he like?" She thought about this honestly, the way she preferred to think about Thomas, not through the filter of grief which distorted everything, but plainly. "Generous and impractical," she said. "He had enormous ideas and very little head for the management of them. He needed someone who could see the details." A pause. "I needed someone who could see beyond them. We were useful to each other." "That sounds like more than useful." "It was," she said simply. "It was a good marriage. Not a perfect one, but a real one. I miss him the way you miss a limb, not every moment, but whenever you reach for something." Gideon nodded, accepting this without trying to improve upon it. They sat in the Sunday light for a while in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and Marin thought that this specific kind of quiet between two people who didn't need to fill space was something she hadn't expected to find again. She didn't name what she was thinking. She only put it carefully away and went back to her supply list. The following Tuesday, she told Gideon she was ready. "Ready for what?" Jesse asked from behind her, because Jesse was almost always somewhere nearby. "Nothing that concerns you," Marin said pleasantly, and handed him a sack of flour to carry in from the wagon, which solved the immediate problem of his presence. She and Gideon met that evening by the light of the same lamp, and she laid out what she had assembled. Not 12 pages this time, but a single sheet, clean and spare. The plan reduced to its essential mechanics the way a good recipe is reduced to its essential steps. She walked him through it. He asked 3 questions. She answered 2 of them immediately and told him honestly she didn't know the answer to the third, but here were the 2 most probable outcomes. He listened the way he had always listened, fully, without performing it. When she finished, he said, "If this works, we don't just save the ranch." "No," she said. "We give the neighboring ranchers something they can take to federal investigators. The Fielding family. The Barrows. Everyone Crane has already rolled over." She had thought about this too. She had thought about all of it in the hours between the end of supper and the beginning of sleep. This isn't just about Harlow Creek anymore. It hasn't been for a while. Gideon was quiet for a long time, looking at the single sheet of paper, and she could see the weight of it settling on him. Not just the risk, but the responsibility, which was always heavier. "If it goes wrong," he said. "Then we're no worse off than we are now," Marin said. "We're losing anyway, Gideon, slowly and without recourse. The only question is whether we lose quietly or make enough noise that someone has to listen." He raised his eyes from the paper to her face. "When I stopped you on that road," he said, "I told you it didn't matter to me, personally." "I remember." "That was the truth, at the time." He held her gaze steadily, in the direct, uncomfortable way of a man who had decided to say the whole of a thing. "It isn't anymore." The lamp burned between them, steady and clear. Marin said, "We should go over the timeline again. There are details in the 3rd step that I want to refine." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded, pulled the paper toward him, and they went back to work. Outside, the Montana night pressed close around the cookhouse walls, cold and dark and very large. and inside the lamp held its light, and the plan took shape word by careful word between two people who had each, in their own way, already lost everything once and were not prepared to lose again. The lie had to be perfect, not elaborate. Marin had learned, in 11 years of managing accounts, that elaborate lies collapse under their own architecture. The best deception was the kind that required almost no maintenance, the kind that sounded exactly like the truth because it borrowed the truth's clothing and wore it without alteration. What she needed was something that Aldous Crane would believe because he was already predisposed to believe it, something that would make a greedy man greedier, which was the easiest thing in the world to do, because greed was its own blindness. They chose a Thursday morning to set it in motion when the ranch had its regular rhythm and nothing would appear unusual. Gideon rode into Dunmore Flats openly, the way he always did for supply runs, and while he was there he stopped at the assay office and conducted a conversation with the assayer, loudly enough and in front of enough people, about a survey he'd commissioned along the Harlow Creek corridor. He spoke of mineral deposits. He mentioned, with the studied casualness of a man trying not to show his excitement, that he'd had a letter from a Denver investment group. He said he was expecting a courier within the week carrying a promissory letter and a substantial advance, enough to fund the surveying operation fully. He did not look around the assay office to see who was listening. He didn't need to. Small towns were their own telegraph systems, faster and more reliable than wire. By Thursday evening, Marin was watching Roy Sutton from the cookhouse window. Roy had heard. She knew this because she knew what Roy Sutton looked like when he was simply existing versus what he looked like when he was managing information. He had a tells, a slight compression of the lips, a way of looking at nothing in particular while looking at everything. He was doing it now, sitting on the bunkhouse step in the cooling evening air, working a piece of leather through his hands with unnecessary thoroughness. She turned back to her stove and stirred the pot and waited. Friday morning, Roy asked permission to ride into town for personal business. This was not unusual. Gideon allowed his men reasonable liberty on Fridays, and Roy had used this privilege before. Gideon granted it without hesitation or visible interest, and Marin watched from the cookhouse window as Roy saddled his horse and rode south at a pace that was almost, but not quite, urgent. "He'll send a message," Marin said when Gideon came in for his morning coffee. "I had Jesse ride out ahead of him. Separate road." Gideon's voice was level. "Jesse will watch where he goes and who he speaks to." Marin poured the coffee and set it in front of him. "Jesse's reliable?" "Jesse is 22 years old and the most loyal person on this property," Gideon said. "He'd ride into a burning building if I asked him to, which I have never done and never intend to." A beat. "He's also smarter than he looks, which he looks young enough that the bar isn't immediately apparent." Jesse came back 3 hours later with the name of the courier service Roy had used, a private outfit operating out of the back room of a Dunmore Flats dry goods store, the kind of arrangement that cost twice the standard rate precisely because it asked no questions. Jesse had not seen the content of the message, but he had seen Roy pay for urgent delivery, and he had noted the destination as Caldwell. Caldwell, Crane's territory. "It's him," Gideon said that evening, not with satisfaction, with the particular grimness of a confirmed suspicion. "Now we wait," Marin said. Waiting was the hardest part. She had always known this about herself. She was built for analysis and action, and the space between them felt like standing on a frozen river listening for cracks. She kept the cookhouse running with meticulous precision, kept the meals coming out on time and hot, kept her face pleasant and her observations silent, and she counted days. Crane's response came in 4. Not to Gideon directly, that would have been too transparent, but in the form of a stranger who arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, well-dressed in a way that was slightly wrong for the frontier, the clothes too new, the boots barely broken in. He introduced himself as a land assessor from Billings, said he was surveying properties in the creek corridor for county records, asked if he might water his horse and rest briefly. Gideon invited him in for coffee, which meant he invited him into the cookhouse, where Marin was working and therefore present and therefore listening. She worked at her bread while the man, who had the air of someone delivering a performance he'd rehearsed, made careful conversation with Gideon about land values, water rights, and the general economic climate of the territory. He was good. He was precise and plausible, and his questions were subtle enough that they didn't announce themselves as questions. But Marin had spent 11 years identifying where money was actually going versus where people said it was going, and she could hear the shape of an extraction behind every sentence. He was mapping what Gideon knew, what he had, what he might take to protect it. And near the end of the coffee, just as casual as everything else, he mentioned that he'd heard about the Denver investment interest and said, wasn't it interesting timing? And had Gideon given any thought to whether an outside offer might be simpler than the complexity of a mining survey operation? An offer, Gideon said pleasantly, hypothetically, if someone were interested in acquiring the property, the water rights in particular. The man turned his cup. I'm not in that business myself, of course, but I know people who are. Gideon looked at the man with the same gray steadiness he brought to everything. I'd have to know the figure, he said, and I'd need it in writing. And the courier bringing that writing would need to come here, to the ranch, because I don't conduct business of that scale in town. The man nodded, said he understood, said he'd pass the interest along. He left 20 minutes later, and Marin listened to the sound of his horse until it faded, and then she said without turning from her bread, he'll tell Crane that you're open to an offer but cautious. Crane will think the Denver story spooked you into considering a sale. He'll want to move fast before the investors arrive. So he'll send someone with authority to negotiate, Gideon said. Or someone with authority to take, Marin said quietly. The cash delivery story needs to be real enough to touch. We need to make him believe the advance payment is physically here, on this property, before the deal can close. Something that desperate, greedy men can't resist trying to simply remove from the equation. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. You want him to try to rob us? I want him to send someone to rob us, Marin said. Someone with enough authority and enough knowledge to be definitive evidence. An associate, not a stranger. Someone who can be tied directly back to Crane's operation. She finally turned from the bread. And when that person comes, we need to be ready. The preparation took 5 days. Marin managed logistics from the cookhouse. She had become, she realized, the operational center of the ranch in a way that would have seemed improbable 2 months ago. She knew where everyone was, knew the routines, knew the physical layout with the thoroughness of a woman who had cataloged every inch of it from necessity. She drew diagrams. She walked the approaches with Gideon in the early morning when the other men were at breakfast. She identified sight lines, cover positions, the places where a man could be hidden and watch without being seen. Gideon repositioned his men without making it look like repositioning. It was done gradually, in the way natural routine shifts. A man assigned to a different fence section, another moved to the north pasture, the adjustments small enough to be invisible unless you were looking for them. Roy Sutton was not moved. Roy Sutton continued exactly as before. This was intentional. Roy needed to be in place and unsuspecting when the moment came, because Roy Sutton was going to be their second piece of evidence, and Marin had been very precise about the order in which things needed to happen. On the 9th day after Gideon's performance at the assay office, Jesse rode in at noon with the news that a wagon had been seen on the North Road, coming from the direction of Caldwell. 2 men on the bench, 1 in the bed, moving with purpose but not urgency. The pace of men who believed they knew exactly what they were going to find. Gideon came to the cookhouse. Marin was already assembling the last pieces. How many of your men are positioned? She asked. 5. Walt has the barn loft. 2 more in the tree line on the east approach. Jesse and Cole are behind the water trough. He paused. I'll be at the main house. And Roy? Roy is exactly where Roy always is at this hour, mending the south fence. Within sight of the yard, Marin said. Good. When this happens, he needs to see enough of it to know it's over. We need him to make a decision. Gideon looked at her steadily. You think he'll run? I think he'll try to, she said. And I think you should let him get far enough to believe he's succeeded and then have someone bring him back. A man who thinks he's escaped talks differently than a man who's cornered. He'll want to make a deal. She watched Gideon absorb this. He had the military man's instinct for action and the rancher's instinct for patience, and sometimes these pulled against each other, but right now they were aligned. The cash box, he said, on the table in the main house, visible from the window. She had packed it herself. The box was real, old, appropriately heavy. What was inside it was mostly riverstones and 2 genuine bank drafts that were already past their use date, enough to look legitimate under hasty examination. They'll go for the house first. They'll want the box before any deal can be struck. And that's when, she confirmed. He looked at her for a long moment in the quiet of the cookhouse, with the smell of bread and coffee around them and the sound of the ordinary ranch world outside. And she could see that he wanted to say something and was measuring it against the time available. "Marin," he said. "Gideon." She kept her voice steady. "You need to get to the main house." He held her gaze for one more second. Then he nodded, settled his hat, and walked out. She waited in the cookhouse. She had argued, briefly, about her own position in the plan, and Gideon had argued back with the directness that had surprised her by being motivated not by dismissiveness, but by the opposite of it. He did not want her in the yard when armed men arrived, and the argument had carried the specific heat of a man who had decided that her safety mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with her usefulness as a planner. She had accepted the cookhouse position not because she agreed that she needed protecting, but because she recognized that the cookhouse window gave her a clean view of the entire yard, and because she had already thought of something she might need to do. The wagon arrived at 2:30. She watched from the window. 3 men, as Jesse had reported. 2 she didn't recognize and 1 she did, in the way that you recognize someone whose description you've memorized. He was heavy-set, well-dressed in the same wrong-for-frontier way as the assessor, but carrying himself with the authority of a man who was used to issuing instructions rather than receiving them. He had the look of a senior operative, someone Crane trusted with real business. They tied the wagon at the post and came into the yard with the studied casualness of men who had done this kind of thing before. One stayed near the wagon, covering the approach, Marin noted, professional enough to think about exits. The other 2 moved toward the main house. Gideon appeared on the porch. He played it exactly as they had rehearsed. Cautious, mildly suspicious, the manner of a man who had been told someone was coming but wasn't sure of their authority. He let them inside. Marin shifted her attention to Roy Sutton, who had moved from the south fence to a position near the barn where he could see the main house yard. She watched him watch the wagon. She watched the calculation moving through him from 50 yards away, visible in his posture even at this distance, the contained agitation, the assessment of options. Then the sound came from inside the main house. A shout. Not of pain, but of surprise and anger. Gideon's voice. And then another voice. The controlled chaos of a plan arriving at its decisive moment. Walt dropped from the barn loft into the yard. Jesse and Cole came up from behind the water trough. The man by the wagon put his hand toward his holster and stopped when he found 4 rifles pointed at him from the tree line with the persuasive efficiency of men who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. It was over in less than 90 seconds. Roy Sutton ran. He made it to the south fence line, moving fast for a thick-set man, and Marin had already come out the cookhouse door and was crossing the yard because she had something to do before anyone else did it. She didn't chase Roy. She went to his bunk, which she had been given tacit permission to access 20 minutes before the wagon arrived, and she found what she had expected to find. Because a man who corresponds regularly by courier keeps his correspondence somewhere, and Roy Sutton was cautious but not careful, which was a crucial distinction. The letters were in a tobacco tin beneath the loose board under his bunk. There were 11 of them. She had them in her apron pocket when Cole brought Roy back 20 minutes later, sitting slumped on his horse with the look of a man who had jumped from a height and discovered the ground was closer than he'd thought. Roy saw her in the yard and something moved across his face. Recognition, and under it, the specific shame of a man caught not by force but by intelligence. "The letters," Marin said simply, patting her apron pocket. Roy closed his eyes. The interrogation, if it could be called that, happened at the cookhouse table, which Marin had decided was the right location because it was her territory, and because a man sitting at a kitchen table with a woman across from him and a cup of coffee in his hands is a man slightly off his combative footing. Gideon sat beside her. Walt stood at the door. The 3 men from the wagon were secured in the barn. Roy Sutton, facing the tobacco tin open on the table before him and his own handwriting in evidence, made the calculation that a man makes when the exits have all been measured and found insufficient. He talked. He talked for 2 hours. He talked about Aldous Crane's operation with the exhausted thoroughness of a man who has been carrying a weight too long and has finally been given permission to set it down. He named associates, described methods, traced the pattern of acquisition across 4 counties over 6 years. He described the Fielding family's destruction, not simple misfortune, but systematic arson and theft. He described the Barrow homestead's collapse, fabricated debt records and forged documents. He described his own role with a kind of bleak honesty that Marin thought must have cost him something, because Roy Sutton was not, she had decided, a man who had started his life intending to be what he had become. She wrote everything down, every name, every date, every transaction Roy could recall. She wrote it in her precise, close hand, and when he faltered, she asked a specific question that brought him back on track, and she did not let him be vague where precision was available, because vagueness was what men like Crane hid inside. When it was done, the pages in front of her were 23 long. Gideon sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, and she understood what he was doing. He was seeing the full shape of it, the years of deliberate destruction, the lives unmade, the land stolen by a man who had simply never been stopped because no one had ever been in a position to stop him. "Is it enough?" Gideon asked. Marin looked at her 23 pages and at the 11 letters in the tobacco tin, and at the 3 men in the barn who would shortly be making calculations of their own about cooperation versus prosecution. "It's enough," she said. It was well past midnight when she finally sat alone in the cookhouse with the lamp burning low and the pages stacked neatly before her. The ranch was quiet around her, the particular quiet of a place that has passed through a crisis and is not yet sure it's over. She could hear the distant sound of the night watch making his round. Gideon had doubled the watch tonight, old military instinct, and the creak of the building settling in the cold. She thought about the road, the berries in her palm, the hawk turning patient circles overhead. She thought about what it meant to be necessary, and whether necessity was a reason for being alive or whether it was simply what being alive looked like when you stopped looking away from it. Outside, the Montana stars burned in their ancient, indifferent abundance, and the cold pressed against the cookhouse walls, and inside the lamp held its small and stubborn light. And Marin Whitlock sat with her 23 pages of evidence and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full and complicated weight of still being here. Then she got up, banked the fire against the cold, and went to her room, and she slept without dreaming. And in the morning she would make breakfast, and the work would continue, and that was enough. The federal men arrived on a Wednesday, which was the day Marin made her best bread. She had not planned it that way, but she thought afterward that there was something appropriate about it. That the morning the law finally came to the Mercer Ranch, the cookhouse smelled of yeast and warmth and the kind of ordinary domestic industry that Aldous Crane had been trying for the better part of 2 years to permanently extinguish. 3 riders came up the North Road at mid-morning, their horses well kept and their clothes carrying the particular authority of men who traveled on government business. Marshal Daniel Howe led them, a lean, spare man in his 50s with a face like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing and commented on very little. Gideon met them in the yard. Marin watched from the cookhouse window, flour on her hands, and waited. Howe dismounted, shook Gideon's hand with the brevity of a man who had a great deal to do, and said something she couldn't hear from this distance. Gideon gestured toward the main house. The 3 men followed him inside, and Marin turned back to her bread and let the waiting be what it was. She had sent the 23 pages to the federal office in Helena 10 days ago, carried by Jessie in a locked saddlebag with a covering letter she had written herself, organized with the same logic she brought to her account books. The summary first, the supporting evidence in chronological order, the most damning items flagged clearly so that even a reader in a hurry could not miss them. She had included Roy Sutton's signed statement, which Roy had given with the resigned thoroughness of a man who understood that his best available future required him to be useful to the right people. She had included the letters from the tobacco tin, each one dated in cross-reference to the incidents they corresponded with. She had included her original 12 pages of pattern analysis, the ones she had first spread across the cookhouse table in lamplight, while Gideon read them in silence, and the world outside continued not knowing that anything had changed. She had also written, in the final page of the covering letter, a precise accounting of the losses sustained by the Fielding family and the Barrow homestead, as best she could reconstruct them from Roy's testimony and her own analysis of publicly available land records. She did this because she had learned, in 11 years of managing accounts, that justice without numbers was philosophy, and philosophy did not compensate a family for a stolen ranch. Gideon came to the cookhouse 2 hours later. She looked at his face and knew before he spoke that it was real. that the machinery of something larger than either of them had engaged and was now moving under its own momentum. "How's sending writers to Caldwell today?" he said. "He's got enough for a warrant. More than enough," he said. A pause. He asked who assembled the documentation. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." He looked at her steadily. "He'd like to speak with you." She wiped her hands on her apron and went. Marshall Howe was a man who listened the way good listeners do, without filling the spaces, without leading the witness, without the impatience that betrays a mind already formed in its conclusions. He sat across the main house table from Marin and asked her to walk him through the documentation, and she did, and he asked 3 specific questions, all of them precise and none of them soft, and she answered them with the same precision. And at the end of it, he looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "I've been doing federal work for 22 years. I have received exactly 2 pieces of private documentation in that time that were organized well enough to be used without alteration." He tapped the pages before him. "This is the 3rd. Marin said, "The pattern was there. Someone needed to write it down." "Someone with your training might write it down," Howe said. "Most people wouldn't know how." She didn't reply to that. There was nothing useful to add. Howe and his men rode out that afternoon carrying copies of everything, and Marin went back to her bread, which had proofed beautifully in the time she'd been away, and she punched it down and shaped it and let it rise again. And the ordinary rhythm of the work was a kind of steadying force she had come to rely on more than she had expected. Walt appeared in the cookhouse doorway at supper time, which he did with some regularity now, less to ask for food than to conduct what Marin had come to understand were his version of social visits, which consisted primarily of standing in the doorway, commenting on the smell of whatever was cooking, and occasionally sharing information he believed to be relevant. "Heard the federal men took half a saddlebag worth of papers," Walt said. "They did." "Heard it was your papers." "They were." Walt was quiet for a moment, doing the thing he did where he appeared to be studying the middle distance while actually processing something. He was 61 years old, she had learned, and had worked for the Mercer Ranch for 14 years, and his gruffness was so thorough and consistent that it had become a kind of integrity. You always knew exactly where you stood with Walt, because Walt was constitutionally incapable of saying anything he didn't mean. "Good," he said finally. She looked up at him. "Good?" "I said good." He shifted his weight, mildly discomfited by the attention. "I've been watching this place get picked apart for going on 2 years and couldn't do a damn thing about it because I couldn't see the shape of it. You saw the shape of it." He looked at her with the direct, undecorated regard of a man who did not give credit where he didn't believe it was due. "That's worth saying." Marin held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you, Walt." He nodded once and moved away from the doorway, which was as much of an exit as Walt ever made. She stood at her stove and felt the warmth of it, and thought that this specific moment, this small and undramatic acknowledgement from a man who had looked at her on her first morning and made his judgment plain, was perhaps the thing she would remember longest from all of it. The days that followed had the quality of a held breath slowly released. The ranch continued its work. There was always work. The land did not pause for human drama. But there was a different quality to the air, a loosening, as though something that had been wound tight for a long time was carefully unwinding. Jesse whistled while he worked, which he apparently had always done before the incidents began, and had stopped without anyone noticing until he started again. 2 of the fence sections that had been jury-rigged were properly repaired. The barn door was rehinged correctly. Small things. The kind of things you only notice in their absence. On the 6th day, word came from Dunmore Flats that riders had been seen on the Caldwell Road, not Crane's men moving out, but federal men moving in. The Territory Telegraph did its work, and by evening there were 3 separate accounts of Aldous Crane being taken from his Caldwell estate in the company of 2 federal marshals, and while the accounts differed in their picturesque details, they agreed on the essential fact. Gideon heard this news from the supply wagon driver who came up from town, and he came directly to the cookhouse, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not joy, exactly, too complicated for joy, but the specific complicated relief of a man who has been holding a position under siege for a very long time and has just watched the opposing force begin to withdraw. He sat down at the cookhouse table, and she put coffee in front of him and sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them said anything because neither of them needed to. Then Gideon said quietly, "My father built the first fence post on this property with a hand axe and a steel wedge. Took him all morning. I was there." "You told me," Marin said. "I know." He turned his cup in his hands. "I keep thinking about it. How something that takes all morning to build can be lost so much faster." He looked up at her. "It almost was." "But it wasn't." "No," he said. "It wasn't." A long pause. "Because you saw a pattern in 12 pages of notes that I couldn't see in 2 years of living it." Marin shook her head slightly. "You were too close to it. You were inside it. It's harder to see the shape of something when you're standing in the middle of it." "You were also in the middle of it." "I came from outside," she said. "I didn't have history with this land yet. I could see it the way a stranger sees a thing. Clearly, because I had no reason to expect it to look a particular way." She paused. "That's not intelligence, that's just position." Gideon looked at her for a long moment with that gray, measuring regard that she had come to know as well as she knew her own kitchen, the way it carried weight without pressing it, the way it gave the impression of seeing more than it announced. "Marin," he said. "Don't," she said gently. He was quiet. "Not yet," she said. "There are still things that need to settle." He accepted this, as he had always accepted her corrections to the plan, not because he lacked the will to push back, but because he had learned early and without much drama that when Marin Whitlock said a thing was not the right time, she was generally correct about the timing. The federal investigation moved with a speed that surprised people who expected government machinery to be slow. Marshal Howe, it turned out, had been building a separate case against Crane's land operations for over a year, lacking only the specific connective evidence that Marin's documentation had supplied. The 23 pages were, as he had indicated, usable as assembled. They slotted into the larger framework like the final pieces of a structure whose scaffolding had been waiting. Crane was held in Helena pending arraignment. 3 of his senior associates were taken within the week. 2 county officials, who had been quietly facilitating the land record forgeries, were suspended from their positions pending further investigation, their involvement traceable through the paper trail that Roy Sutton's letters had illuminated. Roy himself, having provided cooperation of the quality and completeness that he had, was looking at a substantially reduced outcome, something Marin had neither arranged nor opposed, because Roy Sutton was not her to adjudicate. And the fact that he had been a man in a difficult situation doing a wrong thing did not make him innocent, but also did not make him simple. What mattered more to her were the letters that began to arrive at the ranch in the weeks following Crane's arrest. The first was from a woman named Clara Fielding. It was written on plain paper in the careful handwriting of someone who had learned to write as an adult and used the skill deliberately, each word chosen. Clara Fielding wrote that she had heard what had happened at the Mercer Ranch, had heard about the evidence and the arrest, and that she and her husband were being contacted by federal investigators about the possibility of recovering their land and receiving compensation for the losses they had sustained. She wrote that she didn't know who had assembled the documentation that made this possible. She had heard it was a woman. She wrote that she wanted that woman to know that her family had spent 14 months believing they had simply been unlucky, that her husband had blamed himself, that the believing it was your own fault was in some ways worse than the loss itself, because it meant the wound had no author, no face, no one to hold responsible. It just existed, inexplicable, like a punishment from an indifferent universe. Knowing the truth, Clara Fielding wrote, was not nothing. It was not the ranch back, not the years back, not the things that couldn't be restored. But it was the difference between a wound that heals and a wound that festers, and she wanted the woman to know that. Marin read this letter at the cookhouse table in the early morning before the men were up, in the quiet that belonged entirely to her. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it with her things, and she got up and started the fire for breakfast, and she moved through her morning in a different quality of light. Not brighter, not easier, but somehow more solid, more grounded, as though the earth had thickened beneath her feet. 3 more letters came in the following 2 weeks, from different families, different properties, all with the same essential shape, the relief of understanding, the complicated gratitude of people who had been given back the dignity of knowing they were not simply victims of their own inadequacy. She answered every letter. She wrote back in her precise, careful hand, and she said what she had learned in 38 years of living and one very specific afternoon on a Montana road, to be true. That what had happened to them was not their failure, it was someone else's crime, and those were profoundly different things, and the knowing of it mattered. Gideon found her at the table one evening working on one of these responses. He read the letter she was answering without asking permission, because they had arrived at the kind of ease where asking permission for such things would have been a step backward, and when he finished, he set it down and stood behind her chair for a moment. "You're going to answer all of them," he said. "Yes. Every family. Everyone that writes." She dipped her pen. "It matters to them. And I know something about needing someone to say directly that what happened to you was not your fault." He was quiet for a long moment. She could feel him standing there, the solidity of him, the way he occupied space without requiring acknowledgement of it. "Maren," he said. She set her pen down and waited. "I know you said not yet." His voice was measured, carrying the words with care. "I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm just going to say something, and then I'll leave it alone for as long as you need." She turned in her chair to look at him. He was standing with his hat in his hands, which she had noticed was the position he occupied when he was being most honest. When the hat was on, there was still a certain performance of competence and authority. When it was off, there was just Gideon. "This ranch has been the most important thing in my life for 40 years, he said. "I've organized everything else around it, my father's work and my own, and every reasonable plan for the future." He looked at her steadily. "In the past 3 months, I have spent more time thinking clearly about the future than I have in the past 6 years. I don't think that's coincidence." She looked at him in the lamplight. She thought about the road. She thought about the berries, their small and perfect darkness in her palm. The decision she had been half a second from making when the sound of a horse on gravel had interrupted the quietest moment of her life. She thought about what it meant that she was here, in this cookhouse, having this conversation, not as a miracle, because she didn't believe in those, but as the accumulated result of 10,000 small choices made by two people who had separately run out of easy options and kept moving anyway. "I appreciate the rain," she said finally. He looked at her. "When it rains here," she said, "the hills turn a color I've never seen anywhere else. I noticed it in my second week. I didn't say anything about it because it seemed beside the point at the time." She paused. "It's not beside the point." He understood her. She knew this because he was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was holding something carefully, not saying nothing, but holding. "No," he said at last. "It isn't." She turned back to her letter and picked up her pen, and he went to the door, and at the door he stopped. "The Barrow family is coming through next week," he said. "They wrote to me. They want to see the property, the evidence site where the investigation is centered. They have children. 3 of them." He paused. "I thought you might want to know." "I'll make sure there's enough food," Maren said. She heard him almost whoosh laugh as he went out. The Barrow family arrived on a Tuesday, which was not, it turned out, as good as Wednesday for bread, but Maren made do. There were 5 of them, a man and a woman in their 40s, weathered and careful in the way that people are careful when they have recently been through something they are still processing, and 3 children ranging from perhaps 8 to 15. The oldest, a girl with her mother's dark eyes and her father's way of holding her shoulders squared, watched Maren from across the cookhouse with the particular regard of a young person deciding whether an adult was worth their attention. After supper, beef stew with proper dumplings, a dish Maren had chosen deliberately for its warmth and its volume, the girl appeared at the end of the cookhouse table while her parents talked with Gideon on the porch. "Are you the one who found out about Crane?" she asked. Direct, no preamble, the question of someone who had been raised in a family that didn't waste time on the approach. "I found the pattern," Maren said, cleaning up. "Several people did the rest. Papa said a woman proved it." The girl paused. "He said if she hadn't proved it, we'd have lost everything for nothing and nobody would ever have known why." Maren looked at her. "What's your name?" "Ellie." "Ellie." She set down her cloth and looked at the girl directly, the way she preferred to be looked at herself. "Your father's right that the proof mattered, but I want you to understand something about how the proof happened." She chose her words with care. "I was able to see it because I knew how to look. I knew how to look because I'd spent years working with numbers and records and patterns. That's a skill, like any other skill. It can be learned." A pause. "Don't ever let anyone convince you that what you can see or understand is limited by what you look like or where you started." Ellie regarded her with those dark, serious eyes. Did someone tell you that? That it was limited? Many someones, Marin said. For many years. Were they right? What do you think? Marin said, and she picked up her cloth again, and the ghost of a smile moved across Ellie Barrow's face like light crossing water, quick and real and gone, and she went back to her family on the porch. Marin finished cleaning her kitchen in the long late light of a Montana evening, and outside she could hear the low sound of voices. Gideon and the Barrow parents, Walt somewhere nearby being characteristically brief, Jesse asking the youngest Barrow child something that made the child laugh, and the sound of the ranch in the early autumn air, alive and working and undefeated. She had not planned to be here. She had planned, on a nameless road 4 months ago, to be nowhere at all. She thought about what it cost, being here instead. The reopening of things she had closed, the risk of building something new when the last thing she'd built had been taken from her without apology or recourse. The particular vulnerability of a woman who has decided, against all recent evidence, to try again. She thought it was worth it. She was not certain. She was not the kind of person who arrived at certainty quickly, and she had too much respect for the complexity of things to pretend otherwise. But worth it and certain were different measurements, and she had always been better with the ones that required precision than the ones that promised simplicity. She hung up her apron and walked out of the cookhouse into the evening air, and the hills to the west were the color she had noticed in her second week. That particular Montana gold that existed nowhere else, that she had filed away as beside the point, and then discovered was not. And Gideon was standing at the edge of the porch light watching her come out, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't either. And the evening held them both in its enormous, indifferent, strangely tender light. Winter came to the Mercer Ranch the way it always came to Montana. Without apology, without transition, one morning simply arriving fully formed and permanent. The hills white and the air carrying that particular cold that had no interest in your opinion of it. Marin had been through Montana winters before, on Thomas's ranch further south, but she had forgotten the specific quality of this one. The way the silence deepened under snow, the way the cookhouse became the gravitational center of the entire property. Men appearing at the door with less and less pretense of having another reason to be there, and more honest acknowledgement that warmth and food and the particular steadiness of this room were things they needed. She did not mind. She had always been someone who understood that feeding people was not a lesser act than any other act. It was, in fact, one of the most fundamental. The daily, repeated insistence that people mattered enough to be nourished. She expanded the breakfast menu in November, adding a slow-cooked porridge with dried fruit and rendered fat that Jesse declared, with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a young man who had stopped pretending not to love the cookhouse, the best thing he had eaten since his mother's kitchen. Walt, predictably, said nothing about it and had 2 portions. Marin adjusted the quantities. The formal proceedings against Aldous Crane began in Helena in late October and continued through November. Marshal Howe sent regular updates, not because he was required to, but because he had developed, over the course of the investigation, a precise and professional respect for the woman whose documentation had made his case prosecutable, and he communicated this respect through the practical currency of information. The charges were extensive: land fraud, extortion, criminal conspiracy, arson by proxy, and 6 related counts that the federal prosecutor had assembled with visible satisfaction from the layered evidence that Roy Sutton's confession and Marin's records had provided. 3 of Crane's senior associates had accepted plea arrangements in exchange for testimony. 2 county officials had resigned their positions and were facing separate proceedings. Crane himself had retained the most expensive legal representation available in the territory, which said something about the degree of his confidence that money could solve the problem that money had created. The federal prosecutor, Howe wrote, was not impressed. Gideon read these updates at the cookhouse table in the evenings, and Marin read them beside him, and sometimes they discussed the details, and sometimes they simply sat with the knowledge that the machinery they had set in motion was grinding forward on its own now, no longer requiring their direct input, which was both a relief and a strange kind of displacement, like setting down something heavy you've carried so long that your arms feel odd without the weight. Crane's lawyer is arguing the land transactions were legitimate, Gideon said one evening, reading from Howe's latest letter. They always argue that, Marin said. She was mending a tear in one of the supply sacks, the needle moving in the even rhythm of long practice. The question is whether the forged county records can be traced back to his specific direction, or whether his associates will accept that liability themselves. Howe says 2 of them already have. Then it won't hold. She pulled the thread through. A man who builds an operation the way Crane built his, through intermediaries, through deniable layers, assumes that the layers will protect him. They do, until they don't. Gideon folded the letter. You sound certain. I'm not certain, she said, as she had said before in situations where certainty was being offered as comfort she didn't think was earned. I'm confident. Those are different. He looked at her with the slight shift around his eyes that she had come to recognize as his version of amusement. You know, he said, most people, when things are going well, allow themselves a little more comfort than is strictly warranted. Most people, Marin said, and then they're surprised when the thing they were too comfortable about turns out to need attention. Is that what happened with Thomas's ranch? The question was quiet and direct, the way his questions always were, and she appreciated the directness even when the subject was tender, perhaps especially then because being treated as someone who could bear honesty was its own form of respect. Partly, she said, I managed the accounts and I saw what I was asked to see. I didn't look at the legal structure because Thomas handled that, and I trusted that it was sound. She paused. I won't make that mistake again. What mistake? Trusting someone? Trusting without verifying, she said. Those aren't the same thing either. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd like to show you something tomorrow, if you're willing. She looked at him. Show me what? The property records, he said. All of them. Deed, water rights filings, the survey maps, everything. He held her gaze steadily. I'd like you to look at the legal structure. She understood what he was offering. Not the documents themselves, those were straightforward enough. But the transparency behind the offer, the deliberate laying open of everything, the invitation to verify rather than simply trust. It was the most practical and therefore the most honest form of the thing that had been building between them through the winter preparations and the long evenings, and the letters to the Fielding and Barrow families, and the moment on the porch when the Montana light had held them both, and neither of them had needed to name what it was. Yes, she said, I'd like to see them. The documents were thorough and clean. The ranch's legal foundation was sound, which pleased her not because she had doubted it entirely, but because she had not verified it, and she preferred verified. She spent a morning with the maps and filings spread across the main house table, working through them with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. And Gideon sat across from her and answered her questions when she had them, and left her alone when she was working, which was exactly the right thing to do. The water rights documentation was particularly well constructed. Harlow Creek's water rights had been filed by Gideon's father in the territory's earliest registration period, which gave them a seniority that Crane's legal team had apparently recognized as an insurmountable obstacle to legitimate acquisition, hence the illegitimate approach. Your father was thorough, Marin said. He believed in writing things down, Gideon said. Said a man's word was only as good as the paper it was on, and the paper was only as good as the office it was filed in. A pause. I thought that was cynicism when I was young. Seems like wisdom now. It's both, Marin said. Most useful things are. She reorganized the filing system while she was at it. Couldn't help it. It was the way her mind worked, and the existing organization was functional, but not optimal. She created an index and noted 3 filings that needed renewal in the coming year, and 1 survey boundary that appeared to differ slightly from the current fence line, which she flagged for Gideon's attention with a brief note explaining the discrepancy and the 2 most likely explanations for it. He found the note on top of the reorganized files and stood reading it with an expression she had learned to read as the one he wore when something had surprised him pleasantly. You reorganized the whole thing, he said. The index is on top. The renewal deadlines are marked in red. He set the note down and looked at her across the main house, and the winter light came through the windows in the particular flat way it does when there is snow on the ground outside. And it was not the golden evening light that had held them on the porch in the autumn, but it was honest light, the kind that shows things as they are. And what it showed was 2 people standing in a room that had started to feel, to both of them, like a shared place. Marin, he said, I want to ask you something directly. All right. Are you staying? The question was simple and enormous, She had known it was coming, since sometime in October, probably since the evening she had told him what the hills looked like in the rain, and understood that she had said something about herself that she hadn't intended to say and hadn't tried to take back. She thought about Edmund's face across the funeral supper. She thought about the boarding house landlady and the word kind carrying all the weight of contempt that a short word can carry. She thought about the road and the berries and the hawk and the sound of a horse on gravel arriving at exactly the moment it arrived. She thought about 12 pages of notes spread in lamplight. She thought about Roy Sutton's tobacco tin. She thought about Clara Fielding's letter and Ellie Barrow's dark, serious eyes and the question the girl had asked. Were they right? And what it had meant to answer it. She thought about Walt's 2 portions of porridge, silently and without comment, the most Walt form of approval available. She thought about what it meant to build something. Not the first time, when you are young enough that the building feels inevitable and loss is still theoretical, but the second time when you know exactly what it costs to lose and you choose to build anyway. That was a different kind of courage than the first kind. Harder, she thought, more honest. I'm not going back to being someone's cook, she said. That was a beginning. It served its purpose. Gideon held absolutely still. If I stay, she said carefully, I stay as your partner. In the management of this property, the accounts, the records, the legal filings, the planning, all of it. Equal say in decisions that affect the ranch's future. She held his gaze with the directness she had never, even in the worst of the past year, been able to set aside. I've spent 11 years making a ranch work without the authority that work deserved. I won't do that again. No, he said. She felt something in her chest tighten. No, you won't do that again, he said, and the precision of his meaning was so typically him that it almost made her close her eyes. I'm not asking you to be my cook, Marin. I haven't thought of you as my cook since approximately your 3rd week here. He paused. I'm asking if you're staying. The terms are yours to name. She looked at him for a long moment in the honest winter light. Then yes, she said. I'm staying. The formal trial of Aldous Crane concluded in February. He was found guilty on 9 of 11 counts, the 2 acquittals being on charges where the evidentiary chain had a gap that his expensive lawyer had successfully exploited. Something Marin had actually predicted in a letter to Howe in November, noting the specific weakness and suggesting a way to address it that came too late for the prosecution to fully incorporate. Crane was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and the forfeiture of properties acquired through documented criminal means, which amounted to the majority of his holdings. The Fielding family received their land back in March, along with a compensation figure that was not everything they had lost. Nothing could be everything they had lost, but was substantial and real, and came with a written federal acknowledgement that what had happened to them was a crime, not a misfortune. Clara Fielding wrote to Marin when she received the notice. The letter was 3 pages long, and Marin read all of it and folded it carefully and put it with the others. The Barrow family's situation was more complicated. Their original structure had been partially demolished, and the land had seen changes that required legal untangling. But by April, the federal investigators had worked through it, and the outcome was not the original ranch restored, but a settlement that gave the family the means to rebuild, which they intended to do. Ellie Barrow, who was 15 and apparently had decided that Marin Whitlock was worth her serious attention, wrote her own brief letter, not through her parents, but directly, in the same no-preamble style she'd used across the cookhouse table. Papa says you know how to do accounts. I want to learn that. Can I come and learn sometime? Marin wrote back and said yes. Walt heard about this and appeared in the doorway of the main house office, which was what the main house table had effectively become, given that Marin now spent her mornings there managing the ranch's accounts and records while Gideon managed the physical operations, and they met in the early afternoon to align, and said, "You're taking on a student." It appears so. 15-year-old girl. 15-year-old girl who can see patterns, Marin said without looking up from the ledger. Those are rare, worth developing. Walt made a sound that was not quite a comment and was not quite agreement, but existed in the complicated territory between them. Then he said, Jesse wants to know if you're going to teach him the accounts too. Jesse, Marin said, has other strengths. That's what I told him. She looked up. Walt was wearing the expression he wore when he was satisfied with something, but was not going to say so. Thank you, Walt, she said. He nodded and left. The spring came gradually and then completely. the way Montana Springs did, and the ranch moved into the planting and calving season with a full complement of hands and the repaired infrastructure and the functional water access that Harlow Creek had always promised. And now, without interference, delivered. The cattle numbers were rebuilding. 2 new fence sections had been installed over the winter. The South Corral had a new gate that Gideon had hung himself over 3 days. With Jesse's help and Walt's supervision and Marin's periodic appearance with coffee, that was entirely practical and had nothing to do with the fact that she found it difficult to be in a different building from the work when it was happening. She had not expected this about herself. The way the ranch had become hers, not legally, not yet in the full formal sense, though she and Gideon had spent a February afternoon with a lawyer from Helena who was now preparing documents that would make it so, but in the way that a thing becomes yours before the paperwork confirms it, through the accumulated investment of attention and work and care. She knew this land the way she had known Thomas's land, through the soles of her feet and the contents of her ledger and the specific quality of light at different hours in different seasons and the names and habits of every animal on the property. She knew it, and she was known by it, and the difference between those two things had collapsed into one. One evening in late April, with the windows open for the first time since October and the smell of the thawed earth coming through, Gideon came into the main house office and sat across from her while she was finishing the quarterly accounts, which were, for the first time in 3 years, by her reconstruction of the previous records, solidly in the black. Not dramatically, not extravagantly, but honestly and sustainably, which was more valuable than either. He watched her finish the column she was on and set her pen down. "The Harrington family," he said, "over the East Ridge. I've been talking to them about a grazing agreement for the summer. Shared access to the upper pasture in exchange for labor during calving." "What are the terms?" He told her. She asked 2 questions. He had the answers, which meant he'd done his thinking before bringing it to her, which she appreciated, not because she needed him to have done all the thinking, but because it meant he was taking the conversation seriously. "Adjust the labor provision," she said, 2 weeks instead of 1, for the upper pasture access. The upper pasture is worth more than 1 week of labor in a good calving season, and this is going to be a good calving season. "How do you know?" "Because I've been watching the cows," she said, "and because the winter feed quality was better than last year, and because the records show a correlation between winter nutrition and calving outcomes that goes back to your father's time." She pulled a page from the stack and turned it toward him. "Here." He looked at the page. He looked at her. "You found this in the old records." "I found it and cross-referenced it with the current data and extrapolated a projected outcome." She paused. "I could be wrong." "But you don't think you are?" "I think I'm right about the 2 weeks," she said. He nodded slowly. "2 weeks it is." He pushed the page back across the table. "What else?" This was their rhythm now, the one they had built through the winter and into the spring, the daily alignment, the questions and answers, the respect that moved in both directions without requiring acknowledgement of its own direction. She knew which decisions were his to make from the land, and she knew which were hers to make from the numbers, and she knew which ones required both of them sitting across a table until the shape of the right answer emerged from the overlap. She had been right, all those months ago, to say that his knowing the operation and her knowing the numbers were together enough. She had not known, then, how thoroughly enough they would be. "The Barrow girl is coming in June," she said. "Ellie. She wants to learn accounts. I'll need some time for that." "Take what you need. It won't interfere with the quarterly work." "I know," he said simply. "Take what you need." She looked at him across the table in the late April light, with the spring smell coming through the windows and the ledger in front of her showing an honest black. And she thought about what it meant to be seen, not around the edges of your usefulness, not despite the way you looked or the space you occupied, not as a problem to be accommodated, but directly, fully, by a man who had hired a woman he didn't know to cook in a broken kitchen and had discovered, as she had discovered him, that the most important things arrive in the forms you least anticipate. "Gideon," she said, "Marin, I want to say something." He waited in the way he always waited, completely, without performance. "When you stopped me on that road," she said, "you told me you had nothing to offer but an observation about what you'd seen other men regret." She held his gaze. "That was enough. I want you to know that was enough. You didn't fix anything. You didn't try to fix anything. You just offered something real, and it was enough. He was quiet for a moment. The spring air moved through the room. "You did the rest," he said. "We did the rest," she said. He reached across the table and his hand covered hers briefly, with the same matter-of-fact directness he had extended to her on a gravel road in the autumn. A handshake then, something warmer now, but carrying the same quality. "This is real, and I'm not pretending it isn't." She turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that for a moment in the evening light of the ranch that was both of theirs now, and outside the Harlow Creek ran clear and uncontested through the spring land, and the cattle were moving in the lower pasture, and Jessie was whistling somewhere near the barn, and Walt was doing whatever Walt did in the evenings that no one had ever quite determined, and the ranch breathed around them, alive and working and whole. She had come here with nothing. She had come here without even the intention of staying alive past a single afternoon. And she had been wrong about that. Wrong the way you are wrong about something you simply haven't seen fully yet, the way you're wrong about a road that looks like it ends and turns out to bend. She had done the bending. She had brought her skills and her grief and her stubborn, irreducible capacity for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos, and she had put them to use in a broken cookhouse on a failing ranch, and somewhere in the process of that usefulness, she had discovered that the life she had believed was entirely behind her was in fact only partially so. That the part ahead was not a consolation prize or a diminished second act, but something different. Not better than what she'd had, not worse, but real in its own terms, built on the specific foundation of who she had become rather than who she had been. The woman who had stood on a road with 7 dark berries in her palm was still inside her. She would not pretend otherwise, would not insult the truth of that moment by claiming it had simply been a bad day. But she was not only that woman anymore. She was also the woman who had spread 12 pages of notes across a table in lamplight, the woman who had run a bucket line in a burning barn, the woman who had looked Roy Sutton in the eye across a cookhouse table and let the evidence speak for itself, the woman who had written back to Clara Fielding and told her the truth about fault and crime and the difference between them, the woman who had said yes to a man who asked her terms before he asked her answer. She was, she realized, the woman she had always been, the one who saw patterns, who held things in her head all at once, who noticed what didn't fit, who kept records and asked questions and refused to accept that the evidence in front of her was less trustworthy than the comfort of a simpler story. She had always been that woman. She had simply been surrounded for too long by people who needed her not to be. Here, she was surrounded by people who needed her to be exactly that, and the difference was everything. Summer arrived with the generosity that follows hard winters, the grass coming in thick on the creek pastures, the upper range green and deep, the calving numbers coming in exactly where Marin's projections had put them, which Walt acknowledged by appearing in the office doorway and saying, without preamble, "You were right about the calving," and then leaving, which was the Walt form of an ovation. Ellie Barrow came in June, as promised. She was 15 and serious and asked better questions than most adults Marin had known, and she had a natural instinct for the logic of accounts. The way a ledger told a story, the way numbers arranged in sequence revealed a narrative that words could obscure. Marin spent 3 mornings a week with her over 6 weeks, and at the end of it, Ellie could construct a basic quarterly account and read a land record and identify the 3 most common forms of financial irregularity that people used when they were trying to take something that wasn't theirs. On the last morning, Ellie sat back from the finished practice ledger and said, "I want to do this. Not just for my family's ranch, for other people." "You mean professionally?" Marin said. "Is that possible? For a woman?" Marin looked at her for a moment. "It is more possible than it was," she said. "It is less possible than it should be. The gap between those 2 things is where the work is." She paused. "Are you willing to do the work?" Ellie Barrow looked at her with those dark measuring eyes that already knew how to see patterns, and she said, "Yes." Marin sent her home with 3 books, an accounting text, a territory land law primer, and a copy of the federal records filing procedures that she had annotated herself. She wrote a letter to Clara Fielding that went with Ellie, describing her daughter's aptitude in the specific evidence terms of someone who did not offer praise she didn't believe, and recommending that Ellie be given every available opportunity to develop it. Gideon found her on the porch that evening after Ellie had ridden south, watching the light do what it did in summer, going gold over the hills in the long, slow way of long northern days. You're going to produce another one like yourself, he said. One hopes, Marin said. He sat beside her on the porch steps, close enough that his arm was against hers, which was where things had arrived between them. Not with drama, not with the kind of declaration that required a witness, but with the gradual, honest accumulation of two people who had decided to be in the same place and kept making that decision day after day until it became simply the shape of their lives. I got a letter from Helena today, he said. The lawyer. The documents are ready. She looked at him. The partnership filing, he said. Mercer and Whitlock, equal shares, co-managing partners of the Harlow Creek Ranch, he paused. I had him change the ranch name. It seemed right to name it for the water, since the water is why we're still here. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the hills going gold. Mercer and Whitlock, she said. Or Whitlock and Mercer, he said. The lawyer said alphabetical order would put Whitlock first. Mercer and Whitlock is fine, she said. Your father's name belongs first on this land. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Will you come to Helena with me to sign them? Yes, she said. They sat on the porch steps of the ranch that was both of theirs, in the evening light that was specific to this place and no other. And the creek ran somewhere below them in the quiet, and the land breathed in its slow, enormous way, indifferent to the small human dramas that played out across its surface, and yet somehow also their container, holding the weight of all of it, the grief and the work and the courage that looks like stubbornness from the outside, the choosing and the building and the refusing to stop. Marin Whitlock had come to the end of a road in the autumn with nothing left. She had found, at the end of it, not rescue. She had rescued herself, in the way that strong people do, by choosing to pick up a tool that was available and use it. The tool had been a cookhouse. The tool had been a notebook and a pen and 12 pages of careful observation. The tool had been a man who asked her terms before he asked her answer. She was not the woman who had stood on that road. She was not that woman either. She was what comes after. Not the end of a story about loss, but the beginning of one about what loss, survived and used and finally set down, leaves behind. Outside, the Montana evening held its light longer than seemed possible, the way it did in summer, as though the land itself was reluctant to let go of the day, and Marin let herself feel it, the warmth of it, the solidity of the step beneath her, the arm against her arm, the sound of the creek running clear in the distance, all of it real, all of it hers, all of it still here.